It always begins the same way. A quiet road, a familiar sky, a routine day that feels stitched into the ordinary fabric of life. And then, without warning, something unthreads. Somewhere in the sealed drawers of forgotten agencies, there are reports that never made it into public archives. Events labeled with careful language. Not impossible, not unreal, just inconsistent, unresolved, unfit for explanation. Because to name something impossible is to admit a fracture in the world we trust. We live by patterns. Gravity pulls. Time moves forward. Sound travels from a source. Cameras capture what stands in front of them. These are the agreements we rarely question. But what happens when the agreement breaks? When a highway vanishes for 4 seconds and returns as if nothing happened? When a siren sings across 3 counties and no one can find the machine that made it? When objects rise gently off tables and an entire town feels the weight of the earth loosen? There are stories like these, scattered like ash in the margins of official memory, witnessed clearly, documented briefly, then erased, not always with malice, sometimes with discomfort, because the strangest incidents are not the ones that roar, they are the ones that blink. A missing moment, a frozen frame, a silence where something should have been. In this documentary journey, we aren't chasing monsters, we aren't declaring conspiracies, we are listening to the thin places, those rare instants when reality feels less like stone and more like paper. 10 restricted incidents were once gathered under a quiet internal label, impossible to classify. Not because they proved another world existed, but because they suggested ours may be less stable than we assume. A long-haul trucker on a rural Wisconsin highway described a void ahead of him, as if the road simply stopped loading. His dash camera did not record darkness. It recorded nothing at all, only a perfect freeze, a refusal to witness. A ham radio operator in Ohio captured a siren tone that didn't belong to any network. When slowed down, it wasn't a siren at all, but layered signals, precise, almost deliberate. A school basement in Oregon gained a door that was never built, opening into a darkness that swallowed light itself. A stranger walked through a crowded plaza in Illinois, seen by 14 people, captured by none. Every camera skipped the moment he should have appeared, as if machines obeyed a rule the human eye does not. And somewhere, on an unmarked tape in Nevada, a voice ends with 3 words that feel less like a sentence and more like a warning. It found us again. These are not tales meant to frighten. They are tales meant to unsettle the way we think about knowing. Because the deepest mystery is not whether something impossible happened, it's what it means that someone tried so hard to make it disappear. Tonight, we begin with the first file, a highway, a truck, a moment where the world ahead became a blank page, and a man who was awake when reality blinked. It began like any other early delivery. August 12th, 2005. Highway 41, Wisconsin. The kind of stretch that breeds silence. Flat, empty, the road unfolding like a line drawn across a quiet dream. Darren Holt, a long-haul trucker, was used to these miles. He liked them. Predictable, uneventful, nothing but the soft rumble of tires and the occasional flicker of radio static. But at 4:17 a.m., the world in front of him vanished. Not into fog, not into darkness, into absence. Darren described it later as a hole in the air, like someone had erased the highway ahead and replaced it with pure black. No stars, no horizon, just a void with no depth no end. The dashboard lights flickered. The radio stopped mid-sentence. And for 4 long seconds, nothing existed in front of him. He slammed the brakes, but there was no jolt, no skid. The truck felt momentarily weightless, floating across a space that had no surface. When the world returned, it snapped back instantly. The same lane lines, the same trees, like someone had hit play after a pause he hadn't agreed to. But something was different. His dash cam, the one that should have shown the road disappearing, was frozen on a single frame. A clear, undisturbed image of the highway. Timestamp 4:09, but the footage jumped nearly 8 seconds. No movement, no distortion, just a missing moment that refused to be filmed. When investigators reviewed the file, they didn't call it a glitch. They called it physically impossible. Darren pulled over, hands shaking. He wasn't sure if he was hallucinating or falling asleep at the wheel. But then he saw it. The tire marks. A short, clean trail that ended abruptly, like the pavement itself had vanished beneath the truck and only reappeared mid-roll. The investigation lasted 11 days. Unusually long for an incident blamed on equipment malfunction, but leaked internal notes told a different story. Phrases like void phenomenon and inconsistent with known physical models appeared beneath thick black redactions, and yet in the public report Darren's name wasn't mentioned. The footage, archived improperly, then retrieved by officials who offered no explanation. The only copy Darren kept disappeared in a break-in that left everything else untouched. Afterward, he tried to keep driving, but something had shifted. The road no longer felt stable, like it could slip beneath him again. He quit trucking 6 months later. Still, rumors linger on Highway 41. Other drivers speak of the air turning heavy, of headlights briefly illuminating nothing, of the strange quiet that sometimes falls without warning, like the world is holding its breath. Maybe Darren's 4 seconds were unique, or maybe they weren't. Maybe the world isn't continuous. Maybe it blinks, like a system refreshing, a reality that occasionally forgets itself. And for those few caught in between, it's not a dream or a delusion. It's a moment when the code falters and the road doesn't load. What happens in those pauses? What slips through the silence? What else is awake in the black? What if a sound could come from nowhere and everywhere all at once? June 3rd, 1992, just after midnight. 3 counties in southern Ohio stirred from sleep to the same impossible noise. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a weather alert. It was a siren. Long, stretched, metallic, piercing, yet perfect, as if crafted by something that didn't use air or mechanics to make sound. Witnesses compared it to an air raid horn filtered through a cathedral pipe organ. It rang across hills and valleys for exactly 17 minutes. But no town claimed it. People walked into their front yards, stood barefoot on cool porches, looking skyward. Not because they saw anything, but because the sound seemed to come from everywhere, equally loud in every direction. A woman in a farmhouse swore it echoed inside her own chest. Callers flooded dispatch lines. Police, fire stations, even hospitals reported the same question over and over. Is this your siren? Every department answered, no. At exactly 12:17 a.m., the sound stopped. Not faded, stopped. Cut off mid-wail as if severed with a knife. What followed was a silence so deep, so uncanny, that witnesses described it as waiting for an echo that never came. The next morning, county officials held a joint review. They expected a rogue weather system or prankster. Instead, they uncovered something far stranger. None of the counties shared emergency infrastructure. The siren systems were on different networks. Their frequencies didn't match. Their control boards weren't even remotely compatible. There was no known way for a signal to trigger them all. Except someone did record it. A ham radio enthusiast named Mitchell Crane, scanning late-night frequencies, had picked up the tone, caught it between 49.8 and 50.1 megahertz. That bandwidth wasn't used by any civilian emergency alert system. The recording was real, crisp, undeniable. He handed it to county officials. Within days, it was passed up to the state. Then it vanished. 2 weeks later, Mitchell received a polite letter. The tape could not be authenticated. It was not needed. But he knew what he heard. After slowing the audio, Mitchell discovered something layered beneath the tone. It wasn't one sound. It was three. Three separate waveforms, weaving in and out with digital precision. Not analog, not random, patterned, coordinated. He believed it wasn't a warning. It was a transmission, a message. When journalists followed up years later, the official response was brief. No siren event was logged. No malfunctions reported. But something else wasn't reported either. At the exact moment the sirens stopped, dispatch logs from 2 counties noted an anomaly, a jump in the system clock. Not backward, not forward, just missing. A gap of exactly 17 minutes. As if time hadn't moved through those minutes but been rewritten, overwritten, like data replaced on a tape. Today it's known unofficially as the Midnight Siren. But on paper, it doesn't exist. No source, no origin, no system, no failure. Just a sound that visited and then erased itself. Still, people remember the hum, the air vibrating, the way the sky felt closer. They say it didn't ask for help. It didn't warn. It called. But for whom? And who answered? March 9th, 1974. Red Vale, Colorado. A town with one school, one diner, and not much else. The kind of place where time moves slow and gravity always pulls the same direction, until it didn't. It began just after 2:14 p.m. A postcard display in a corner shop lifted, gently, like it was caught in an invisible tide. The cards didn't fall. They floated. At the same moment, a teenager told his mother he felt like he wasn't touching the ground. A waitress in the local cafe watched a fork rise off a table, rotating softly as if on strings. Across town, laundry baskets, pebbles, even coffee from a mug drifted upward, not flung, but lifted. For 179 seconds, just under 3 minutes, Red Vale lost its weight. And the world fell silent. No wind, no birds, no footsteps. Not even the low thrum of power lines. People didn't scream. They didn't run. They watched, still, transfixed, as everything known obeyed something else. The police dismissed the first calls. But within an hour, 28 reports came in, nearly identical. Words like floating, weightless, bent air. At 3:50 p.m., the local weather office filed a single line in a carbon-copied report. Anomaly suspected. Investigate. Everything after that line was redacted. But 3 names in the report surfaced years later during a legal review of regional records. 3 witnesses interviewed separately under oath, whose stories matched down to the moment. Beverly Rhodes, who said her coffee rose from her cup and splashed upward against the ceiling. Thomas Wilder, who felt the gravel under his boots go soft, like bouncing on clouds. Eleanor Pike, who described the entire town tilting slightly, as if the earth had hiccuped. Their testimonies were stamped, verified, and then the documents disappeared. Not misplaced, removed, cabinet drawers emptied, files reclassified, no record of what replaced them. But Red Veil remembers. There's one photo, blurry but chilling, found in 1998 under floorboards in the Old Town Library, a row of wooden chairs suspended 2 feet above a classroom floor. The timestamp, 2:16 p.m. 2 weeks after the image was found, it vanished from the town newspaper's archive, taken by unidentified officials. No request, no return. And then, the clocks. Every analog clock in Red Veil jumped ahead by 3 minutes after the anomaly ended. Not synchronized, not evenly, but they all moved, as if time didn't resume. It restarted. Scientists blamed magnetism. Psychologists called it mass suggestion. Officials offered no explanation. But residents know what they felt: the absence of gravity and something else. A brief widening of the world. A moment where the rules loosened, where gravity, time, and silence rewrote their agreement with reality. Today, Red Veil doesn't talk about 1974. The cafe is gone. The school rebuilt. The original witnesses are mostly gone now, too. But the memory lingers. Because for 3 minutes, gravity stepped aside. And in that quiet, weightless pause, something looked back. Not to terrify, not to conquer, just to remind us physics is not a promise. It's a habit, and habits can break. Hawthorne Middle School, Oregon. Autumn 1986. The building was ordinary. Beige halls, linoleum floors, fluorescent lights that hummed just a little too loud. It had stood since 1954 without major renovation, a place where nothing strange had ever happened. Until the door appeared. Robert Lier, an electrician with 2 decades of routine under his belt, arrived early to fix a flickering light in the basement. He'd been down there dozens of times. 2 storage rooms, a boiler cage, a corridor lined with cabinets. No surprises. But that morning, at 7:42 a.m., there was a door. It stood at the far end of the corridor, industrial grey, clean, featureless. No signs of wear, no scratches, no handle scuffs, no dust disturbed around it, except for Robert's own footprints. It looked newly built, but the wall around it told another story. The concrete wasn't cut. The frame had no seams. It hadn't been added. It had always been there, except it hadn't. Robert felt the air change as he approached. The door was cold. Not basement cold, refrigerated cold. Still, he reached for the push latch and opened it. What he saw wasn't a room. It wasn't anything. Behind the door was blackness so complete, his flashlight beam stopped at the threshold. It didn't fade. It didn't dim. It ended, as if light itself had nowhere to go. He whispered into the space. No echo. He reached his hand forward and felt nothing. Not air, not cold, not space, just absence. Then the darkness moved, not swirled, not shifted. It expanded, just slightly, like a shadow stretching toward him. Instinct took over. He slammed the door. The cold vanished. At noon, Robert returned with a district inspector. Together, they descended into the basement. The door was gone. In its place, smooth, unbroken concrete. Seamless, unchanged. No marks, no dust trail, nothing. The inspector suggested stress, low light, imagination. But Robert wasn't the first. 2 months earlier, a janitor had quit suddenly after claiming a new room appeared near the boiler cage, then vanished the next day. His report was ignored. Blueprints were checked again. That section of the basement had no history of renovation. No door, no additions, not ever. Still, the district sealed the basement for 3 weeks. When it reopened, Robert's incident report was missing. The inspector denied ever signing anything. Robert retired early. He never returned to Hawthorne. He didn't fear the door. He feared what was behind it. Something that obeyed no architecture, no light, no rule of space. Something that arrived unbuilt, opened into nowhere, and left without trace. A presence that did not enter our world. It unfolded inside it. And for one moment, it was open. If our structures are made of matter, light, and logic, what do we call something that ignores all three? Not a door, a breach. And perhaps it didn't vanish. Perhaps it's still there, waiting for someone else to see it. Not to go through, but to be seen by it. Northern Washington. Late summer, 2010. The forest there is old. Trees that predate the road. Mist that clings too long after sunrise. Locals say it's easy to get lost. Not because the paths change, but because the forest seems to forget them. That night, a 6-person search and rescue team entered the woods to locate a missing hiker. Standard protocol. Radios checked, flashlights loaded, GPS flickering slightly, but working enough. At 8:41 p.m., the first voice called out, "Help, please, someone." It wasn't a scream. It was too controlled. Desperate, yes, but delicate. Human. Every team member heard it. They froze, then moved fast. Announced their presence. Called out in response. But the voice had no direction. It echoed from all sides, bouncing off trees that muffled its origin, as if it came from the forest itself. They split into 2 groups. The voice repeated, "Help me." Same tone, same pitch, same trembling breath, but no change in urgency, no fatigue, no strain, just repetition, like a recording, like something impersonating panic. One team raised their directional mic, trying to triangulate the source. The signal spun, then locked, straight up. Not north, not west, up, into the trees, into the sky. At 9:12 p.m., they found a clearing. Circular. The trees around it leaned inward unnaturally, bowing toward the center. The ground was cold, too cold for the season. The wind stopped, and the voice changed. It no longer begged. It whispered, "I see you." One rescuer radioed base. Another shouted, but before the shout ended, the voice overlapped it, echoing the last syllable before it was finished. Here, it wasn't reacting. It was predicting. A rescuer dropped their pen onto the dirt, marking the spot. The mic needle twitched. Beneath the voice, another sound emerged. A low, rhythmic oscillation, faint, pulsing, not animal, not mechanical. When the team returned to base, pale and silent, they reviewed the recordings. The voice sounded human, frightened, a woman's voice. But the waveform analysis told another story. There was no vocal fold vibration, no breath signature, no human anatomy behind it. The voice had structure, but no source. The report filed that night was 3 pages long. The official version? 8 sentences. The clearing was never mentioned. The audio was labeled corrupted. The pen the rescuer dropped? It wasn't found the next day. But something else was. The hiker, disoriented, dehydrated, but alive. She'd never screamed. She insisted she hadn't said a word, but she had heard something. A woman's voice, calling for help, always the same distance away, always the same tone, and always just out of reach. When she tried to follow it, it stayed ahead. a fixed echo in a forest that pulled her deeper with every step. What speaks with a voice that doesn't tire? What calls without moving? What mimics our desperation flawlessly? Not a person, not a predator, a presence. One that sees through sound and answers when you record it. Not because it wants help, but because it wants to know who's listening. October 4th, 1951. Harrow Junction, Montana. A forgotten railway stop. One bench, one platform, 4 scheduled freight trains a day, all predictable. It was the kind of place where routine wasn't just expected, it was the only thing holding time together. At 9:30 a.m., the telegraph clicked. A short message from Central Dispatch. Train 47 delayed, arriving shortly. The station master frowned. There was no train 47. Not that day, not that week, not on any schedule since 1942. Still, the message was authentic. The operator ID was real. He logged it, confused. At 9:36 a.m., the warning lights came on. At 9:37, the rails began to vibrate. And at 9:38, a train appeared. Black engine, 4 boxcars, no markings, no sound. The metal wheels should have screamed on steel. But the train moved silently, like gliding through snow. The station master stepped out to flag the conductor. But there was no one in the cab, no engineer, no crew, just a dark window reflecting the autumn light. The train slowed to a stop. The temperature dropped, 15 degrees in seconds. The birds fell quiet. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. He climbed to the cab, knocked, opened the door. Empty. No coat, no coffee, no sign of life. He moved to the manifest box on the lead car. Inside, one torn sheet of paper. Harrow Junction. Scheduled drop. Cargo redacted. Date blank. The cargo line had been scratched out violently, but behind the gouges, faint impressions remained, as if someone had written something and tried too hard to erase it. Before he could study it further, the train lurched. No warning, no engine rev. It moved like it had simply decided. And just like that, it vanished behind the pines. When he radioed Central, they denied sending the message. There is no train 47, they said. Do not log phantom activity. The original dispatch record? Gone. The station master was reassigned within 48 hours. His desk emptied. His notes erased. The manifest sheet disappeared. Years later, railway archivists found something curious. In 1942, Train 47 had existed, a classified courier route, cancelled after a derailment that killed the crew. The engine was never recovered. The cargo never found. The number 47 was retired, yet 9 years later, it arrived. Exactly 3 minutes late. No route, no crew, no sound. Some witnesses said it felt like the train wasn't a vehicle at all, but a recording, a memory trapped in metal, a loop trying to complete itself. And others believe it wasn't a memory. It was a message that something once erased can return, unscheduled, unexplained, but not forgotten. Not by the rails, not by the air, and not by those who were meant to see it. What kind of cargo demands to be delivered after time itself has moved on? What kind of train runs on tracks that no longer exist? If you ever hear the whistle where no train should be, step back. Not everything that arrives is meant to stop. May 22nd, 1998. Riverside, Illinois. A normal afternoon. Sunlight on the fountain. Teenagers skating the plaza. Parents collecting kids from school. Cameras rolling. recording the mundane rhythm of a Friday downtown. And then he walked through. At 4:19 p.m., a man passed through the plaza. No one remembers him doing anything unusual. No one recalls him speaking. But everyone remembers seeing him. Tall, thin, black hair, charcoal grey suit, outdated but neat. Hands clasped behind his back, eyes cast slightly downward. A slow, deliberate walk, like a man studying the geometry of his own path. 14 people saw him, but the cameras saw nothing. A barista at the corner cafe watched him stride past the patio, his reflection catching in the window. But when she checked the security feed, the sidewalk was empty. No glitch, no blur, just blank. Across the square, a teenager felt a tingling in the air, like static before lightning. Another swore the man didn't blink. A little girl, holding her mother's hand, pointed and whispered, "Why doesn't that man have a shadow?" At 4:23 p.m., a city surveillance camera aimed directly at the plaza flashed white. 1 second of pure overexposure. When the feed resumed, people in frame turned their heads as if following someone who wasn't there. Police gathered reports. 14 eyewitnesses described the same man in striking detail, down to the texture of his tie. Statistically improbable, the investigators called it. The CCTV footage told a stranger story. Each camera glitched at precisely the moment the man should have passed through its field of view. Not random static, not weather interference. The anomalies were synchronized, precise. They weren't recording errors, they were gaps, intentional absences. A police officer reviewing the footage wrote, "Something is missing, not lost, refused." A sketch was compiled from the witness reports. When circulated internally, it was stamped with a rare classification, mass perceptual event. But that didn't explain what happened next. 3 days later, the security company collected the DVRs for analysis. When the drives were returned, the time window between 4:19 and 4:31 p.m. was replaced with static, not erased, overwritten, as if something had passed not just through the plaza, but through the systems built to observe it. One delivery driver gave the closest encounter. He said the man turned slightly as they passed, just enough for their eyes to meet. He described what he saw as a hallway that shouldn't exist. No reflection, no depth, just space and silence. Somewhere the mind couldn't fully follow. As if he were looking not at a person, but at a placeholder, a variable, something that walks when we aren't looking and flickers when we try to record it. 14 people saw him. No device did. Not one pixel, not one shadow. As if the cameras knew better. As if they were protecting something we weren't meant to retain. A stranger that moved through light, but not through lenses. A man who passed through memory, but not through time. The question isn't why the cameras failed. The question is, what kind of presence chooses to be seen only by the human eye, and not by the machines we trust more than ourselves? Eldridge, Montana, January 14th, 1963. Just after dawn, the town stirred beneath a piercing winter sky. Sunlight bounced off snowbanks. The air was cold, but familiar, until it changed. At 7:12 a.m., it began to snow. That, in itself, wasn't strange, but what followed was. A rancher, Jonas Hill, was the first to feel it. A snowflake landed on his wrist and didn't melt. It burned. Not heat, not frostbite, something in between. An absence of temperature, a cold so intense it hollowed sensation. Within minutes, others reported the same. Two children walking to school stared up in silence. The snow didn't drift. It fell in perfect vertical lines, straight down like silver needles. The world turned blue-white and glassy. Vision blurred, not from fog, but from too much clarity. By 7:15, the snowfall intensified. People ducked indoors as flakes burned on contact. One mail carrier described it as, "Freezer burn on my face instantly." Animals refused to step outside. Metal doorknobs became untouchable. The air glowed, not with sunlight, but with something colder, sharper. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the snow stopped. 7:20 a.m. Flakes froze mid-fall for half a second, then dropped lifelessly. The brightness faded, the color drained from the air, and reality reassembled itself. But the town wasn't the same, because the snow didn't melt. It evaporated, left behind a fine, powdery residue. Not water, not ice, something else. Residents collected samples in jars, tins, even bare hands, though many regretted it. The powder clung to skin, stung lips, caused brief hallucinations in at least 2 cases. When samples were sent for analysis, the reply was brief and chilling. Zero water structure detected, not consistent with snow. When forwarded to state authorities, the event was dismissed, relabeled, refiled under a new title, Unusual Ice Crystals, Cause Unknown. 3 days later, federal agents arrived. They collected everything, every sample, every container, even the lab tools that touched them. No explanation, no records, just a quiet warning. This event is weather-related. Do not inquire further. But Eldridge remembered. 2 photographers had captured images that morning. When developed, every frame during the 8-minute snowfall was overexposed, blinding white, except one. Taken at 7:18 a.m., it showed flakes suspended in mid-air, perfectly shaped, geometrically unnatural, not curved, not branching, angular, faceted like crystals from a world with different rules. A scientist who saw the photo years later said only 5 words. That's not from the atmosphere. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was never weather. Maybe it was contact. A passing brush from something that interacts through temperature and geometry. A presence that moves in light, that sends messages shaped like snow. And if it ever comes again, the town of Eldridge will remember. The sting on the skin, the glow in the air, and the truth whispered in silence. Not all storms come from clouds. Some fall from elsewhere, carrying designs we were never meant to feel. Pine Hollow County, September 11th, 2021. 2:14 a.m. A quiet stretch of Route 19. Locals called it the Nap Lane, barely a kilometer long, too short to matter, too empty to remember. 2 sheriff's deputies drove its length that night. Standard patrol, bored conversation, nothing unusual. Until the GPS glitched. The map flickered. The road ahead twisted on the screen, then looped back onto itself. A perfect circle with no start or end. They laughed at first. Mountain towns and bad reception. But when the odometer passed the 14-minute mark, unease settled in. The intersection they should have reached in under 2 minutes never came. The deputy in the passenger seat leaned forward, frowning. Did we miss it? The driver slowed. Trees hugged the shoulder, tight and familiar. Same bent guardrail, same cracked reflector, scratched diagonally like it had been hit long ago. Then 3 minutes later, it appeared again. The exact same reflector. By the 4th time, laughter was gone. Panic had begun. They radioed dispatch. No response. Not static, not noise, silence. Like the signal wasn't blocked, it was gone. The driver turned around. The GPS shifted with them, warping into spirals, figure eights, shapes that weren't maps. At one point, it displayed a geometry neither could recognize. At 2:26 a.m., the passenger did something strange. He dropped his pen out the window, just to see. 8 minutes later, it was there again. Same pen, same position, same patch of cracked asphalt. The driver slammed the brakes. They sat in silence. The pen was cold, too cold, not like the night air, cold like something that had been pulled from another place, not cooled, emptied. At 2:31 a.m., fear overtook training. They veered off-road into a field, bumping and sliding through wet grass, unsure if they'd get stuck. Then, 3 beeps. GPS signal restored. Dispatch came through instantly. "We've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. You weren't on Route 19, they said. You weren't on any road." The deputies insisted they never left the asphalt, that they looped the same 900 meters over and over again. Dispatch insisted their GPS beacon vanished at 2:13 a.m. and reappeared miles away at 2:32. Nothing in between. The official report labeled it environmental interference, but the internal notes told a different story. A screenshot from the patrol car's GPS showed 12 identical loops, 12 perfect circles, each enclosing an impossible space, a sealed slice of reality. The pen they dropped was logged as evidence, but the next morning, it was missing from the evidence room. The security footage froze. 33 seconds of static, starting at exactly 3:33 a.m., the moment the pen vanished. Today, the deputies still talk about it. The repetition, the nausea, the fear of being trapped in a loop that didn't want to end. A road pretending to be a road. A geometry that doesn't belong in maps or in minds. If you ever find yourself driving the same stretch of road again and again, stop, because you might not be retracing your path. You might be inside something else, something drawing you, until it decides you're done. Some recordings were never meant to be found. No name, no agency, no date, just a reel of magnetic tape unearthed during a 1997 cleanup of an abandoned emergency communications hub in Nevada. Inside a plain envelope, yellowed and creased, was a single message scrawled on the flap. "Don't let it loop again." The tape ran 2 minutes and 19 seconds. Audio hiss, then voices, 2 of them, faint, urgent, clipped. Their speech distorted, warped, as if dragged unevenly across time. Negative contact, repeating pattern, hold position. A pause. Then the second voice, trembling, "No bearings, it's moving without..." The tape cut to silence. Not static, not noise. Absence, the kind of silence that doesn't play back. At 0:49, the voices returned. The first whispered, "Don't acknowledge it. Just keep talking to me." The second tried to speak, but faltered, as if words were crumbling mid-air. Then, a strange rhythm surfaced beneath the tape. Not mechanical, not biological, a pattern. Structured, but without origin. Analysts would later call it a signal that isn't a signal. At 1:37, the first voice came through clearly. Too clearly. "Do not respond to it. If you respond, it learns you." The next sound was a sharp gasp, then a thud, and then deeper silence, a kind that refused to decode. Not blank, subtracted, as if whatever was recorded had been carved out, leaving only the shape of what used to be. At 2:18, one final voice surfaced, flat, resigned. It found us again. Then nothing. No tape click. No end hiss. Just absence. Technicians tried to trace its source. Failed. They isolated the final phrase, hoping to analyze the speaker. Instead, they found echoes within the waveform, resonance patterns consistent not with speech, but with playback, as if it wasn't spoken. It was repeated by something listening. A retired engineer proposed the tape wasn't a recording of people speaking. It was a capture of something else entering the transmission, a presence using the signal as a mirror. Each time someone listens to the tape, it changes, slightly, the pitch of the voice, the tempo of the oscillation. And sometimes, the final phrase sounds like it's waiting. Technicians stopped playing it in the office. They said it left the room feeling colder. Devices glitched, lights flickered, and once, just once, a line of dead air appeared in a live broadcast. One archivist, shaken, wrote in her notes, "It doesn't end when the tape stops. It listens. Maybe it always has." If true, this wasn't a recording. It was an encounter, and whatever was on the other end is still waiting for someone to press play and respond. Reality is not as sealed as we think. Across decades, across states, scattered among dusty files and forgotten tapes, these 10 incidents whispered the same unsettling truth. Not everything that happens can be explained. Not everything that's witnessed can be captured. And not everything that disappears is truly gone. We've heard the stories. A trucker who drove into nothing and came out the other side. A siren with no source, echoing from air that didn't belong to any network. Gravity letting go over a small Colorado town, and time resuming like a skipped beat. A door that opened into darkness without space. A voice calling from the woods, perfectly human. Except it wasn't. A train that returned after being erased from the schedule and from history. A man who walked through a crowd, unseen by machines. A snowfall that didn't melt and wasn't made of water. A road that became a loop, geometry bending without breaking. And a recording that doesn't play back, it listens. Each event, on its own, is a ripple, but together they form a pattern, a kind of echo, not of sound, but of contradiction. Because what connects these moments isn't their strangeness. It's how carefully they were handled, erased, denied, archived improperly, reclassified, labeled weather, stress, hallucination, malfunction. And yet, the witnesses remain. They remember. Even when no evidence does, even when the cameras fail, even when the clocks jump and the signals vanish. They remember what it felt like. The weightlessness, the cold that burned, the pause in the world, the silence that hummed with something more. Maybe none of these stories prove anything. Maybe they aren't evidence. Maybe they're residue, scars left behind by moments when reality thinned. When something, unknown, unnamed, brushed against the fabric of the world and left a mark. We could dismiss them. We could call them mistakes, coincidences, glitches. But if even one is true, then the rules we rely on, time, gravity, perception, continuity, they're not rules, they're expectations, and expectations can be broken. What's more unsettling? The idea that something is watching us, or the idea that the world itself sometimes forgets to hold its shape? This is Archive 9, a record not of events, but of absences, not of stories, but of the spaces between them. What's impossible isn't the incidents, it's that we keep pretending they don't matter. But the gaps remain, and they are growing. The stories you've heard, some were whispered by truckers on long roads, others murmured by search teams huddled around failing radios, or old men remembering the snow that burned. Each one was meant to be forgotten, but they weren't. Not completely, because the strange thing about impossibility is how it clings to places, to people, to memory. Archive 9 didn't begin as a project. It began as a pattern. Unrelated reports with similar signatures. Voices heard with no source. Moments that vanished from footage. Records overwritten, not deleted, rewritten. Like someone editing reality mid-sentence. We noticed something else too. Each incident contained a tension between what was seen and what was allowed to be believed. A trucker quits his job after 4 seconds that broke the rules of space. A ham radio operator is told his recording isn't needed because it couldn't be real. A town watches gravity slip, then is told nothing happened. And yet, in all of them, someone remembered. Someone knew what they saw, what they felt, even when the files said otherwise. That's why Archive 9 exists, not to prove the impossible, but to refuse forgetting. Each file here is a scar, a mark left by something that passed too close. Not to destroy, not to reveal, but to test the boundaries, to press against the fabric. The world isn't breaking, it's blinking, like an eye adjusting to something it wasn't built to see. Maybe these events aren't anomalies. Maybe they're messages. Not for everyone. Just for those who notice the quiet misalignments. The moment a shadow moves the wrong direction. The frame that skips without stutter. The snowflake that burns. The voice that echoes with no lungs to shape it. We don't claim answers, only questions that wouldn't stay buried. We gather what survives. A frozen frame, a whispered warning, a GPS path that loops impossibly. Not to make sense, but to listen. Because someone has to. And the next time reality stutters, when the road doesn't load, or the siren calls from nowhere, or the recording says it found us again, you'll remember too. Not as proof, but as echo. And that's enough. The impossible leaves traces, and we're still following them. So where does this leave us? With 10 incidents, stitched across decades, each resisting categorization. Each bending the rules just enough to leave a mark, but never enough to be believed by those who weren't there. A truck that floated through nothing. A voice that whispered from nowhere. A snowfall that refused to melt. A train that shouldn't exist. A man no camera could see. None of it adds up. But maybe it was never meant to. Maybe these weren't glitches. Maybe they were reminders that the world is not a sealed equation. That some truths arrive in silence or static or a perfectly timed absence. We built Archive 9 not as a vault, but as a signal. A place where what slips through the cracks might still be heard. Because if reality is stable, it must withstand observation. And if it isn't, then paying attention becomes an act of resistance. We do not claim to understand what these moments are. We only insist they matter. They matter because someone remembered them. They matter because someone tried to erase them. And they matter because, despite every effort to the contrary, they persisted. In memory, in whispers, in the quiet artifacts that refuse to fade. Maybe one day, the blanks will fill in. Maybe someone will decode the siren, find the man without a shadow, replay the tape and hear what it really says. But until then, we'll keep listening. To the air that gets too still, to the places where gravity stutters, to the seconds that vanish, to the people who say softly, I saw it, because belief doesn't make something real. But memory is harder to silence, and Archive 9 is built on memory, not on proof, not on faith, on memory that won't let go. You've heard what made it through. Imagine what didn't. And if you ever find yourself standing in the wrong silence or staring into a frame that won't play, ask yourself this: is it a mistake, or is something waiting for you to notice? We'll be here, watching the patterns, following the next fracture, until the signal comes through again. And when it does, we'll be ready to listen, if you're still willing to know. Welcome to Archive 9, and thank you for not looking away.